the little button at the bottom. Okay, thanks, Chris. When Paul Selden and I first published our book, 20 years ago now, 2004, the only real criticism we got of it was the title, which was chosen for us by our publishers. They said, oh, we've got to have some buzzwords, and evolution, fossil, ecosystems, these are all buzzwords. So we'll call the book Evolution of Fossil Ecosystems. But our readers said that didn't really convey what the book was about, which was a chronological description of all of those wonderful sites around the world, that many of which you'll have heard of. And so a friend of mine said, oh, you should have called it probably the best Lagerstatten in the world. And I've always thought that was a great title, so I'm delighted to be able to use that today. So, right, this is misbehaving itself. It's not advancing. What did we do last time? Sorry, we had some technical issues today. It's not... Oh, that's working now. Okay, so what do we mean by this term Lagerstatten? Well, it comes from the German mining tradition, where it effectively means a bonanza or a rich seam. So a fossil Lagerstatten then is a rich seam of fossils. It was first coined by the German paleontologist Dolf Seilacher in 1985, and he defined two different types. First of all, what he called concentration Lagerstatten, or Konzentrat Lagerstatten from the German. This is where you get quantity rather than quality. And it's things like coquinas, shell beds, or the classic example that we describe in the book is the great dinosaur graveyard, the Upper Jurassic Morrison Formation in Midwest US, which Andy mentioned in his holiday geology a few weeks back. But of much more use to us as paleontologists is the second group, the conservation Lagerstatten, Conservat Lagerstatten, where you get quality over quantity. And this is where we get the soft tissue preservation. There's one reason or another, microbial decay has been arrested or at least slowed down, and soft tissue is preserved. And you will all have heard of some of these famous sites. Seilacher also subdivided that into these other three types: conservation traps, which are not particularly common, but it's things like entombment in amber, where the oxygen is sealed from the system and microbial decay just doesn't begin at all, or deep freezing of mammals, mammoths and mammals in permafrost, mummification, etc. But they're quite rare instances. Most of those that we know are either these abrution deposits, so that means burial really, and really rapid burial is always required in the soft tissue preservation. Again, the finer the grain of the sediment, the more chance that more efficient it will be at keeping the oxygen from the carcasses. And so rapid burial is usually required. And the abrution deposits usually sample near shore, shallow water, benthic seafloor ecosystems. The other type that Seilacher described were stagnation deposits, where either anoxic conditions or something that would make the bottom waters hostile to life, hypersalinity, toxicity of one form or another, again, would ensure that scavengers would not be able to survive in the bottom waters, and microbes also would not be able to act. And these tend to sample deeper water, pelagic, open sea communities. But if truth be told, most of those that we describe in the book and that we know about are a combination of ablution and stagnation. So what are the implications of having soft tissue preserved? So first of all, of course, we understand a lot more about the morphology of the organism. Think of modern bivalves, which are classified by zoologists on their gill structure. Well, we normally don't have that as paleontologists. But if in these rare instances, then if we get soft tissue, we know an awful lot more about the morphology of that organism. But the second two are really more important, because you've got to consider that in any one ecosystem at any time, up to 85% of the species and maybe 95% of the individuals are entirely soft-bodied. So think of all the insects and the various worm phyla would, under normal preservational conditions, would have no chance whatsoever of being preserved. So normally the fossil record is really very poor, and normally we're only seeing 15% of the species that occurred in that ecosystem. So if we have preservation of soft tissue, then we get preservation of entire, or at least more entire, ecosystems, and can say an awful lot more about them. So they've often been called windows on evolution, or snapshots of life. You know, you're sort of peering through the curtain at different points in the geological column, and you can see the full picture of soft-bodied ecosystems. And in fact, the German translation of our book was Fenster zur Evolution, which is Windows on Evolution, would perhaps have been a better title. So that was the first edition that we published in 2004, with 14 chapters, all of the common ones that you'll know, like Ediacara, Burgess Shale, Solnhofen, Holzmarden, etc. Then we brought a second edition out in 2012, much expanded and revised, with 6 new chapters. And I do have 2 copies. This is my little sales pitch. I've got 2 copies here this morning. If anybody would like a copy, I checked this morning, they're £43 on Amazon. You can have one for £30. And you can have a signed copy for £25. Then there was a third book that we brought out in 2008. When at last he gave me the senior authorship. And this is just dealing with North American sites, and there's another 10 sites there. So we've got 30 sites described in total. Now, when I committed the cardinal sin of writing the abstract for this talk before I'd written the talk, mainly because Nick was hassling me. But when I wrote the abstract, I mistakenly thought that I could get through about half a dozen of these in this lecture. But when I did start writing the talk, I realized that we would miss the entire rugby match if I did that. So I hope you'll forgive me for indulging myself and just describing the 2, what really are the best Lagerstatten in the world, that you will all know something about. And I'm going to talk about the Burgess Shale and the Solnhofen limestone. But I'm hoping to throw a little bit of a new angle on both of these by comparing them with some extraordinary Lagerstatten that have been discovered just in very recent years, both in China. All new discoveries these days are in China. So I will compare with Burgess Shale. I'm going to compare this site of Chengjiang, and with the Solnhofen, I'm going to talk about this site of G-hole. I think the correct pronunciation is Ye-hole, but Western paleontologists always say G-hole. So first of all, the Burgess Shale. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Burgess Shale. It's a very well-known site, mainly because it's been the subject of quite a bit of popular scientific writing. 2 books in particular, A Wonderful Life by Stephen Jay Gould, published in 1989, and then a reply to that, The Crucible of Creation, written by Simon Conway Morris in 1998. They're both very readable books, and I do recommend them to you. The 2 great evolutionary paleobiologists of our time fundamentally disagreeing on the implications of the Burgess Shale fauna, what that fauna means in terms of evolution, evolutionary mechanisms. So they are very well worth reading. Now, although the Burgess Shale is very well known, it's actually quite a thin layer. It's only a few meters thick, and it's very inaccessible. It occurs high in the Canadian Rockies. This is Mount Wapta on the left in the President's Range, and just offshore on the right is Mount Field. And the ridge joining the two is called the Fossil Ridge. And the Burgess Shale Quarry is the lowermost of those three snow patches. You can just about make the Packhorse Trail that leads up to the quarry. This is the quarry. It remains snow-filled even in summer. This was taken in July when I was there in 2001. Wonderful place to work. That's the view from the quarry. This is the President's Range. That's the Emerald Glacier, which is often cited as an example of a receding glacier as we come out of the Ice Age. And that's the Emerald Lake. And this is the campsite. Currently, while I was there, the Royal Ontario Museum from Toronto were doing some work in the quarry. It was discovered in 1909 by this man with his hand on his hip, Charles Doolittle Walcott. Now, his name is quite a misnomer because he actually did an awful lot. He was secretary of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington at the time, and he was the world expert on trilobites. And the romantic story is that he discovered the Burgess Shale when he was returning from field work in 1909. His wife's horse was supposed to have stumbled on a boulder. Walcott got down to knock the boulder out of the way, and it split open to reveal this myriad of soft-bodied fossils. Unfortunately, his diary doesn't back up that story, but he did at least, we know he discovered it on August the 29th, I think, in 1909. He came back with his family. They used to spend their summers doing field work, and he came back every year till 1914, and then a couple of other visits. He died in 1927 with much work undone, but I just put those figures there to remind me to tell you that he collected 65,000 specimens, which are all currently in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. And out of the 170 new species that were described from the Burgess Shale, Walcott actually was responsible for 100 of those. So he did an awful lot of work. Now, following his death, nobody really wanted to work on the Burgess Shale. They felt it was his project. And then there was the war and the aftermath of the war. Nothing really happened on the Burgess Shale until the 1960s, when the Canadian government realized they didn't have a collection of this stuff because it was all down in Washington. So they proposed the notion of a restudy, and they appointed this man to lead up that study. Now, at this time in the 60s, Harry Whittington was the world expert in trilobites. And because most of the fossils from Burgess are arthropods, that's why they gave the job to him. He's an Englishman, but at the time he had the chair of geology in Harvard. The Canadians are very conservation-minded, and they don't like you collecting any fossils from the field at all. When you walk up to the quarry, you're treading on the most beautiful trilobites that you've ever seen. But if you're caught with one in your rucksack, there are huge fines and more severe penalties. I've got a little anecdote about David Attenborough that I might tell you in the pub afterwards. But they're very conservation-minded. They only gave Harry 2 seasons to collect. In that time, he collected another 10,000 specimens, but interestingly, few new taxa. It seems that Walcott had actually got most of the new taxa. Well, in 1967, Harry moved from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Cambridge, England, and he brought the project with him. He very soon realized that there was more work than could be done by one man in his lifetime, and so he appointed 2 postgrads, Simon Corwin Morris and Derek Briggs, to help him in that work. These are both exact contemporaries of mine, and Chris as well. We all graduated in 1972, so what a wonderful year that must have been. These 2 lads have been given their FRS. Chris and I are both still waiting for ours, but anyway, they worked with Harry through the 70s and 80s, doing some wonderful work, dissecting the fossils using modified dental drills, doing these very detailed drawings using a camera lucida, because we had no CT scanning in those days, no synchrotrons. It was just pencil and microscope. And the team did a fantastic job detailed drawings of these fossils and trying to work out exactly what they were. Now, before I go on to describe the fauna, I just want to introduce this Chinese site that I'll be comparing with it. Chengjiang in Yunnan province, down in the southwest of China. Now, I stole this slide from Joe and Lucy's lecture on Castle Bank a few weeks back when they mentioned what they call BSTs, Burgess Shale type localities, and they said that there'd been about 40 of these discovered around the world since. One of the first, and probably the best, is this one of Chengjiang. And you will see that that is much older than Burgess. This is in the Lower Cambrian, about 520 million years ago. There's Burgess in the Middle Cambrian, about 510 million years ago. So now with Chengjiang, we've got even closer to the Cambrian explosion and can see what was happening in those early Cambrian times. So I'm going to start off with some of the worms, which Simon Comyn Morris was given for his PhD. And I've put these into their paleoecological grouping. So we start off with the benthic infauna. Benthic means living on the seabed. Infauna is living in the sediment. So these are animals that are burrowing in the sediment. And this one, Otoya, is one of the most common at Burgess. It's usually found in a U shape, and so it's assumed that it lived in a U-shaped burrow. This is the mouth surrounded by these vicious hooks, and a proboscis also surrounded by hooks. And these were very vicious animals. They could shoot out of their burrow, catch their prey, because these were predators, and then go back into the burrow. Now, they're still around today, but it's one of these phyla that we as paleontologists never come across, because I only know of one other fossil record in the Carboniferous. Again, shows how poor the fossil record is, because they've been around from the Lower Cambrian to the present. And the phylum that they belong to is the Priapulida. Now, if you know your Latin, these worm groups all have their own common names, and you won't be surprised looking at that picture to learn the common name of the Priapulids. There is a section through one showing the alimentary canal, and just about to be ejected through the anus is a little triangular shell called a hyolith. We don't know very much about these. They may be related to brachiopods. They've got their own phylum, Hyolitha. But clearly the Otoyas were eating the hyoliths. There's another one there. Sometimes you find brachiopods in the alimentary canal, and sometimes you find other Otoyas, because these animals were not only predators, they were also cannibals. And here is one, a priapulid worm from Chengjiang. So we see the preservation is very different. There's red coloration due to iron oxides on this rather orange or buff-colored sediment. But those from Chengjiang tend not to be in the U shape. They tend to be more vertical. And it's now thought that perhaps the U shape was purely due to contraction of muscles on one side of the body as opposed to the other, and that actually they lived vertically in their burrows, which is how they tend to be preserved in Chengjiang. So Chengjiang is actually teaching us quite a bit about the Burgess animals. That one's called Paraselkirkia. There is a genus called Selkirkia from Burgess, which is very similar. Now going on to the benthic epifauna. So these are living on the surface of the seabed, and the sessile epifauna are those that are fixed. And these are quite a high percentage of these, and you'll see why that is later. And I mentioned the sponges because Joe Botting said how very common they were in Castle Bank in terms of number of genera and species. And the same is true with Burgess, which is not surprising when you consider these are the most primitive of the multicellular animals. So there's a number of genera of sponges. This one is very common because rather than being made of spicules, which would then disarticulate on death, this one called Vauxia is made of a material called spongin, which retains its shape on death. And so these are much more common. Named after Mary Vaux, Walcott's second wife. And there is a Chengjiang sponge, the genus Choya, which also occurs commonly at Burgess. So you're getting the same genera and species in both localities. despite their difference in age and their difference in geographical location. Now we go on to the benthic vagrant epifauna. So these are things that are crawling across the surface. And the most common is this little animal called morella, sometimes called the lace crab. This was the first one that Walcott found. He drew that in his diary on August the 29th, little diagram of it. And it was the first one that Whittington worked on when he began his work in Cambridge. The reason Whittington chose this was because it's known, would you believe, from 15,000 specimens from Burgess, and yet it's not known from any other Cambrian locality in the world. Again, showing just how poor the fossil record is. So Harry described this little crab. He showed that it had these 2 pairs of head spines, 2 pairs of antennae, and 20 pairs of identical walking legs. Now, the fact that they're identical is important because it means that they're rather primitive. And Harry couldn't really elucidate the affinities of this animal, and he put it in a group called the trilobitoids. Now, again, Chris, I see you smiling. You probably remember the trilobitoids from our undergraduate days. It was what we call a wastebasket taxon. You put in anything that looked a bit like a trilobite that wasn't, and people didn't really know what they were. Most of those were actually from Burgess. And even before the paper had been published, Harry was annoyed with himself for sort of copping out of trying to elucidate the true affinities of this animal. It had some features of trilobites, but it wasn't a trilobite. It had some features of crustaceans, but it wasn't really a crustacean. So we call it a trilobitoid, but he never forgave himself for doing that. And much later in his career, he debunked that grouping, and he put Morella in a group called the Morellamorphs, with some very similar arthropods from the Devonian and Silurian. And that group are now telling us quite a bit about the early evolution of arthropods. And it's thought that they are ancestral to the 3 great groups of marine arthropods, the trilobites, the crustaceans, and the chelicerates, which includes the spiders and scorpions. Of course, we get normal trilobites in Burgess, Olenoides, one that's found in other Cambrian shelly faunas around the world, but of course, normally we only get the hard carapace. True to form in Burgess, of course, you get all the soft appendages from the underside. There's only 3 localities in the world where you get soft tissue, the limbs of trilobites preserved: Burgess, Hunsrück slate in Germany and the Devonian, and the Silurian site in New York State, Beach's trilobite bed. And even in Burgess, there are only 12 specimens with the limbs preserved. But this was Harry's model of what the soft parts of a trilobite look like. And he showed that every limb had 2 branches, a walking limb with a little claw at the end, and hanging down beneath the walking limb is a feathery gill. So every appendage is responsible for locomotion and respiration. This is another member of the vagrant epifauna crawling across the surface, and it is the iconic animal of the Burgess Shale. And one of the worms, again, worked on by Simon Conway Morris, and he put this in a new genus, which he called Hallucigenia. He gave it that name because he said, this animal is so bizarre, he couldn't put it into any modern day phylum. When he published the paper, he just said phylum uncertain. It's such a bizarre animal that you could only imagine this in some sort of LSD-induced dream of the 1970s. And so that was his description in 1976. Now, since then, there have been a number of Hallucigenia species discovered in Chengjiang. And from these, which we see a lot more information, it became obvious why he thought that this was such a bizarre animal, because he had constructed it upside down. You probably know this story. He originally constructed it standing on these 7 pairs of stilts, waving these tentacles in the air. He thought that was the head and that was the tail. The Chengjiang specimen showed him that these are not stilts. That's actually an array of defensive spines. These are not tentacles, but they're the soft limbs. That's not the head, it's the tail, and that was the head. So he had it upside down and back to front. And for this, he was given an FRS before the age of 40. But I read last week that science progresses by a number of mistakes. So I like to think that I've progressed science quite a lot. Anyway, when you turn it up the other way round, it becomes immediately apparent what it is. It's not a bizarre phylum at all. It's a velvet worm. These are still around today. This is one called peripatus, occurs in New Zealand. But today they're all terrestrial. In the Cambrian, they were all marine. And again, it's one of these worm phyla that we never meet as paleontologists, the onychophorans, sometimes called the lobopods, the lobopodians. And here is another velvet worm from Chengjiang. And this one is rather remarkable in that it doesn't have the spines, but it does have these little sieve-like plates on every segment. Now, we've known these plates for many, many years. They always occur in the lower Cambrian, in the old Timotean stage. And we didn't know what they were. They occur with little triangular fossils and spiny fossils. We've just called them the small shelly fauna, or the SSFs, small shellies. Were these tiny animals in their own right? That's what we used to think. But they bore no resemblance to the much larger animals that came before in Ediacara, which Rachel Wood talked to us about last year. They bore no resemblance to what came later in the typical Cambrian shelly faunas. But now we know what they are. These are not individual animals in their own right. They're just the studs and plates and spines of what were essentially soft-skinned animals. And this presumably is the beginning of the calcification. You know, when the Cambrian explosion occurred at the start of the Cambrian, all these phyla developed hard parts at the same time. And this, we're probably seeing here the beginning of that. Rather than developing a hard carapace over the whole animal, they'll just start off with little plates and spines to give it some protection in this arms race that we talk about when predation increased so much in the Cambrian. So again, Chengjiang has shown us an awful lot, answered a lot of queries, because for many years we had no idea what these small shelly fossils were. Here's another iconic animal of the Burgess Shale. This is one that was given to Derek Briggs to work on for his PhD. He was going to help Harry with the arthropods. And this was named by Walcott. He thought this was a shrimp. This is the body of a shrimp. There's the limbs underneath. And he called it the strange shrimp, or the anomalous shrimp, because it never seemed to have a head. And they also were often preserved in pairs. So Derek started working on this, and his first idea was that maybe this was not an animal in its own right, but maybe these are paired appendages of a much bigger arthropod. And he described this as a sort of meter-long, millipede-like animal with these pairs of limbs on either side. That also turned out to be wrong, but he was on the right lines. Several years later, Harry was dissecting a specimen that he had collected in his trip in the 60s. And he was very surprised when he revealed a pair of these appendages on the head. This is a head with eyes of a much larger segmented animal. And so it turned out that Anomalocaris is not an animal in its own right. It's not a shrimp at all. It's a food-gathering appendage, because the mouth is on the underside of this head, food-gathering appendage of this large predator. And that's what it was reconstructed as, Anomalocaris, between 0.5 meter and 1 meter in length, the main predator of the Cambrian seas. And they weren't sure still which phylum this belonged to, and they thought that it belonged to a very short-lived experimental phylum, which then became extinct at the end of the Cambrian. And when we used to teach this course to students in Manchester, that's what we said for many years. This is an experimental phylum that died out at the end of the Cambrian. Didn't know what it was. Chengjiang to the rescue. Here's a specimen from Chengjiang. There are a number of anomalocaridids in Chengjiang. This one shows the ventral surface. And lo and behold, on the ventral surface are these jointed appendages. So that's the characteristic feature of an arthropod. It's not an experimental phylum. It is, in fact, a stem arthropod. And then in 2009, this specimen turned up. This is pyritized, and that's an X-ray of it. You can see the big eyes. There's the mouth on the underside. There's the food-gathering appendages. But the amazing thing was, this is not from the Cambrian. This came from the Devonian Hunsrück slate, Lower Devonian. So again, how poor is the fossil record? These things had been existing all the way through the Ordovician, Silurian into the Devonian without a single fossil record. And it makes you wonder how much further they persisted through the geological column. But anyway, Harry then, realizing this was an arthropod, called these the great appendage arthropods. Here's another strange Burgess beast, again described by Harry Whittington, Opabinia. And I was at a talk in 1972 at the Paleontological Association conference when Harry put this slide on the screen. It was his reconstruction of Opabinia, and it was greeted by the audience with an audible laugh. They thought, oh, Harry's gone off his rocker at last. How can he possibly reconstruct an animal with 5 eyes on its head, this sort of vacuum cleaner extension coming out of the head with a little grasping process, and then a segmented body and these 3 tail flaps? They thought that he was having a April Fool joke or something like that. But it turned out he was absolutely right. And they now regard this as another one of the great appendage arthropods related to Anomalocaris. So again, a stem arthropod. And you might remember a few weeks back, Joe and Lucy illustrated one of these from the Castle Bank, which they called an Opabiniid-like animal. And this, it's the other way around to the illustration. This is the proboscis on that end. I can't get my head around the fact that their fauna is so tiny. You know, that's going to be 3 millimeters in length, whereas that's a millimeter scale on this drawing. But maybe they occur in Castle Bank as much smaller forms. And then penultimately, this is one of the few genera that new taxa, should I say, that was found in Harry Whittington's time or later collecting. They nicknamed it Santa Claus, gave it the generic name of Sanctocaris. And this is a stem chelicerate. So it's got these 5 pairs of grasping appendages on the head. These are homologous to the appendages on a scorpion or spider. And so it is put into the chelicerate group. And it was thought that this was the earliest chelicerate in the fossil record. True to form, of course, Cheng Jiang produced its own form called Fuxianhuia. And so this from the Lower Cambrian is now the earliest chelicerate. And then finally, this little animal called Pikaia, which is only about 1 centimeter long, but it has a stiffened rod running down the back and these chevron-shaped muscle fibers. And this is thought to be a chordate belonging to our own phylum, showing that the chordates were present in the Cambrian explosion. Again, this was thought to be the earliest chordate. Of course, Cheng Jiang produced its own. This one's called Mylocunmingia. And not only is this a chordate, this is a vertebrate. And not only is it a vertebrate, it's a fish. It's an agnathan fish. So many of us here learnt that fish first appeared in the lower Ordovician. Well, no, they appeared in the lower Cambrian. And the fish and the vertebrates were present in the Cambrian explosion. So I put this paleogeographic map on to just illustrate the distance between the South China Craton in Cambrian times and North America, and yet how remarkable it is that the fossil record there appears to be very good when we've got soft tissue preservation, the same species and genera occurring in both localities, even though they're thousands of kilometers apart. And then just finally, a little word about preservation. How are these animals preserved? So this is the Burgess Shale Quarry. You can just about see the Packhorse Trail going up there. And you can see the bedded rocks above. But as you go north from the quarry, you come into these rather buff-colored, unbedded rocks of what's known as the Cathedral Formation. And it was thought by Walcott that this was a tectonic fault but that can't actually be the case because the beds go right across at the top. This was actually a feature of the Cambrian seabed. This was a near vertical cliff on the Cambrian seabed with a well-lit carbonate platform on the top. But the Burgess animals, it's important to realize, were living at the foot of that cliff in much deeper, darker, muddy waters. Now, there are various features in the quarry that tend to suggest that the Burgess Shale animals are not preserved in the area that they were living. First of all, you can see these centimetre scale bands in the Burgess Shale, which you can follow for tens of meters around the quarry without any interruption or disturbance. Even though we know there were animals living in the mud, there's no apparent bioturbation. Secondly, the Burgess Shale animals are preserved at all sorts of angles in the sediment. Some are upside down, some are head first. They're just jumbled up in the sediment. And thirdly, you'll see that there's a little, these beds occur in couplets of it. There's a coarser grained orange base, which is calcium and iron, and then it grades up into a finer grained gray, muddy top. So these are little graded sequences, and each one of those is a separate episode of sedimentation. So Whittington and Conway Morris came up with this idea of what they called a pre-slide situation where the animals are happily living at the foot of the cliff on the mud. And then something, either an earthquake or a storm or just instability of the sediment pile, sends that mud further down the slope into much deeper anoxic water. The animals are all taken down by the mud storm, and then the mud settles out eventually, and they're preserved at all sorts of different angles within these little graded sequences. The coarser grains settle out first, and then the finer grains on top. So it looks as though the Burgess animals are preserved in an area, not in the area in which they were living. And we call that allochthonous, which I'll use that term later. Now, Chengjiang is similar in some respects. Again, it has these centimetre scale couplets. The fossils in Chengjiang are always found in the lighter layers, and it's thought that these represent storm deposits, or what we call tempestites. And it's thought that the storms flooded this shallow marine basin with huge amounts of fresh water, reducing the salinities that would have killed off the fauna. And then when the storm abated, the muds that had been stirred up settled down on top of that those carcasses and preserved the soft tissue in that way. So the difference between Burgess and Chengjiang is that here the animals are preserved in the area in which they're living, and that's, we use the term autochthonous, so that either allochthonous or autochthonous. And finally, here is a reconstruction of what the Burgess shallow marine ecosystem would have looked like with all of these animals that we've described. So Anomalocaris, Opabinia, Pacaya, some trilobites. Here's the animals living in the shale, the sponges. That's the Burgess Shale or Chengjiang ecosystem. In any other Cambrian shelly fauna in the world, that's all you would see. Just the trilobites, some of the sponges, they're archaeocyathids, brachiopods, and the hyoliths. So it just illustrates again what I said at the start, how poor the fossil record normally is without these Lagerstatten, from which we can elucidate an awful lot more about life at the time. Now, I'm getting a bit of a look from Cindy, which means I've been talking for far too long about the Burgess Shale. And so let's go on to the second. See, it's just as well I didn't do 6. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I forgot my props. That's an Anomalocaris. Would you believe you can buy cuddly toys in these? And this is an Opabinia. I better show those to the Zoom people. I hope you can see those at home, Zoomers. But you can, if you like collecting soft toys, which some people do. You can buy, just name your genus from the Burgess Shale, and we can come up with it. Right, there's another anomalocarid in there. I don't know why she bought two. Pass that one round the other way. Wonderful. Oh, that makes a nice little interlude for me.
What's the scale?
The anomalocaris is probably, I mean, they can be up to 1 meter in length, but Opabinia is exaggerated there. They're much smaller. Okay, let's go up into the Mesozoic and consider the Solnhofen limestone, which again, I'm sure many of you know an awful lot about. Upper Jurassic in Bavaria, in Germany. And of course, the reason we know about the Solnhofen limestone is because of this animal, Archaeopteryx lithographica, the first bird in the fossil record, first discovered in 1861. And you might remember in 2011, both Cindy and I gave talks celebrating the 150th anniversary of the finding of Archaeopteryx. And even today, there are only 13 known specimens. This is number one, the London specimen. It's now on display in the Natural History Museum. It's only been on display in the last 10 years, maybe. They had it all those years without displaying it. But you'll see that this specimen has these lovely feathers preserved on the wings and the tail. And because it had feathers, when it was found at the time, birds were the only animals known to possess feathers, and so it was assumed that it was a bird. There are some other bird-like features, the long, slender hind limbs. And this little U-shaped bone at the top is the furcula, the wishbone. And again, at the time, it was thought that birds were the only animals to possess furculae. And so that seemed to confirm that it was a bird. The Germans were not at all happy that the specimen had come to the Natural History Museum. We paid £700 for it. It seems very cheap compared to what you pay for one of these today. Over €1 million. But the Germans had to wait another 15 years before a second specimen turned up. And this one is now on display in the Berlin Museum, in the Humboldt Museum in Berlin. Again, it's only recently been put on display, but you can go and see that. And actually, it was worth waiting for because it is a much better specimen. Beautiful feathers on the wings. And this one has a skull. Now, although it has some features of a bird, these animals also have many reptilian features. First of all, the long bony tail. Because modern birds, if they have a long tail, they don't have a bony extension to it. They have a little structure called a pygostyle, where the caudal vertebrae are compressed into a smaller structure. The skull, you probably can't see, but take my word for it, is full of little sharp reptilian teeth. It's not a horny beak of a bird. And the hands terminate in these 3 claws external to the wing, whereas a modern bird's fingers are incorporated into the wing. So it has some bird-like features, some reptilian features. And given the timing of the finding of this in 1861, 2 years after Darwin's origin, this was thought to be one of Darwin's predicted missing links between the reptiles and the birds. Now, there's only been 13 specimens found, and I'm not going to go through all of those because there's getting too many of them to go through. But I will just mention a couple of them. This, of course, is my favorite. Number 8, not a very good specimen, but this is the younger specimen from the overlying Mearnsheim beds, just above the Solnhofen limestone. And this was the one that I and colleagues described as a new species a few years back, Archaeopteryx albusdorferi, the original species with lithographica. And we described that as new because it had several features that suggested that it was better adapted to flight. And then number 13, this also came from the higher Mearnsheim beds, about 500,000 years younger. Janet, you'll remember when we were in the quarry, the German television was doing the press release on the discovery of this in 2019. I was there with the OUGS. And that was described and published as a new genus and species, Alcmonavis boerschii. And again, this has some adaptations towards better flight. Although that's now been given a different name, they're still all known by their Archaeopteryx number. So we still call this Archaeopteryx number 13, even though it's now a different genus. So they've come slightly later, 500,000 years later, and showing a little bit of evolution towards better flight. Now I'm going to introduce this Chinese locality that I'm going to compare with Solnhofen. And now we're up in the northeast of the country in this rather remote province of Liaoning, adjacent to Inner Mongolia. And in 1995, the most remarkable Lagerstatten was discovered, that's still throwing up new surprises today. I probably should have said that Chengjiang was discovered in 1984. This was another decade later. And I would say this was the most remarkable fossil discovery of the 20th century. That's my friend Xiaoping, who looks as though he's about to take me out with his pickaxe. But this hit the headlines in 95 because of the discovery of numerous specimens of this bird, which the Chinese called Confucius ornis. Lovely name. Now remember that Archaeopteryx is only known from 13 specimens in 160 years of looking. This turned up in their thousands. So sometimes there'd be tens of specimens on a bedding plane, almost a mass death assemblage. It's the Chinese, you'll see that I've said this as Lower Cretaceous. The Chinese initially described this as Upper Jurassic. They are desperate to find a bird older than Archaeopteryx. And all the early publications quote this as being Upper Jurassic. It's now been, the beds have been dated very accurately by the Americans, neutral opinion, and have given a pretty conclusive date of about 120 million years, so definitely Lower Cretaceous. And that fits because Confucius ornis, again, is a little bit more advanced than Archaeopteryx. It doesn't have that long bony tail. It has instead the little piger style, where the caudal vertebrae just compressed. That's the parson's nose on your Sunday chicken. It doesn't have teeth in the beak. It has a toothless horny beak. So that's the first toothless horny beak in the fossil record. Never mind what you read about that bird that was described last week in the press, Attenborough eye. This is older, Confucius ornis, and that has a horny beak. But it does still have these external claws on the wing. So it's primitive in some ways, but it's more advanced than Archaeopteryx. And this is morphologically and stratigraphically in between Archaeopteryx and what were essentially modern birds at the end of at the top of the Cretaceous. Things like Hesperornis and Ichthyornis, essentially modern birds by the end of the Cretaceous. So before I talk more about Solnhofen, I need to say just a little bit about the lithology and the paleogeography. So we're now back to Solnhofen. Some of you have been to the quarries here, and will remember that there are two distinct facies. The flints, which are these thicker beds, are very, very fine grained and very pure, 95 to 98% calcium carbonate. Pure limestone, very hard porcelainous limestones. And there's, you can see flints here, alternating with the foul beds, which, as their name suggests, have a high proportion of terrigenous mud. So they're 75 to 95% calcium carbonate. They can still be very pure themselves, but the mud gives these this facility or ability to cleave into these sometimes paper-thin layers. Here is a flints quarry, and they've been quarried for hundreds of years. All the buildings in Solnhofen have these roofing tiles from Solnhofen limestone. But nowadays, they tend to be used more for internal tiling. They take a very nice polish. And Marks and Spencer's used to have all their floors tiled in Solnhofen limestone. I don't know whether they still do. I don't spend much time in Marks and Spencer's, but it used to be my ambition to be walking through Marks's and find an Archaeopteryx impression in the floor. So next time you're there, have a look. They're used more for kitchen and bathroom tiling these days. Very expensive, however. Now, the flint has a very different use. It was discovered at the beginning of the 19th century that these very porcelainous layers, if you polish them and then draw on them in an oily ink and etch the surface, you can print from them. And this was the process of lithography that then persisted all through the 1800s, all through the 19th century, until it was replaced by more mechanized methods at the start of the 1900s. But the Solnhofen plates used to be exported all around the globe for lithographic printing. That's why they're often called the lithographic limestones. And that's why that first Archaeopteryx is called Archaeopteryx lithographica. Oh, I said most of this, but so we've got these fine-grained geometric limestones. We use this term platten calx, which means a German word meaning platy limestone. Age is Upper Jurassic, lower part of the Lower Tithonian, Hybonoticeros, Hybonotum, and they outcrop in the southern Franconian Alb, just under 100 meters, period of about 500,000 years. Now, paleogeography, this is the end of the Jurassic. So Pangaea is breaking up, but the South Atlantic hasn't yet opened. South America and Africa still together. There's India about to make its rapid march before it crashes into Asia. But the northern continents have separated, and much of what is northern Europe is now flooded by this shallow Epiric Sea or epicontinental sea. So there is Solnhofen, and the shaded area is meant to represent this shallow epicontinental sea that's on the margin of the deeper water of the Tethys Ocean. And there were restricted lagoons within this shallow sea. Solnhofen protected to the east by the Bohemian Island and protected to the north by the Middle German Swell. And then there were coral reefs also to the east and to the south as a barrier between the shallow sea and the Tethys. That's a sort of model of it. So there's the Middle German landmass, Bohemian landmass. This is the shallow epicontinental sea. Now, from the Oxfordian, these sponge and cyanobacterial mounds began to build up in the shallow sea, dividing the sea into these very narrow basins, which they've called here platten calc basins. This is where the very pure, fine-grained limestone is being deposited. Coral reefs, and there should be coral reefs drawn down here to the south as well. This is from the work of K. Werner Barthel, who sedimentologist, did a lot of work in the 60s and 70s, and this is his model of what was happening. So he thought that the foul was being deposited under normal conditions. When you've got land-derived clay coming into, this is the restricted basin. Here are the sponge mounds dividing the basin into these platten calc basins. There's the reef separating the shallow sea from the open sea. So land-derived clay coming in to the system. But this is Upper Jurassic. We're 25 to 30 degrees north of the equator, tropical to subtropical climate, high evaporation, not very much fresh water coming in from the open sea. So the high evaporation leads to increased salinity, and then you get a salinity stratification with the heavy hypersaline waters going down to the bottom. So the bottom of these lagoons are going to be hypersaline and hostile to life, and maybe a little bit of fresher water, better oxygenated water on the top. And then every now and again, and probably annually, there would be storms, monsoonal storm, when three things happen. First of all, this very fine marine carbonate ooze, which is building up seaward of the reef, would be blown into the basins. So we can say that the sediment is also allochthonous. It's been brought in from elsewhere. Fauna living in the open sea would be washed in from the storms. Fauna living on the tops of the reef would be washed into the basin with the storms. And thirdly, the waters would mix. So now the hypersaline waters at the bottom are mixing with the fresher water at the top. Everything gets too saline, and animals find it inhospitable and fall to their deaths at the bottom of these platten calc basins. And then when the storm has abated, the flints, the very pure limestone, settles out on top of those carcasses and expels oxygen and is able to preserve soft tissue. Now, if you go to Solnhofen, fossils are not that common. Unlike Burgess Shale, where, as I say, you can't walk up to the quarry without walking over trilobites and sponges. In Solnhofen, you don't find an awful lot. Janet will bear me out on that. So, but because it's been collected by hand, quarried by hand for hundreds of years, there have been more than 600 species have been found. So we're going to look at some of the fauna, and as we do that, we'll see whether the fauna can support Barthel's model. Oh, it's only 12 o'clock. I've got another couple of hours yet. So first of all, some of the fish. There are wonderful fish fossils from Solnhofen. This is a bony fish, the group that forms most of the fish today, but this is an early group, the holosteans. A common one called Lepidotus with these very thick ganoid scales. We find it in our own Jurassic off Dorset and Yorkshire coast. And these probably were living in the upper waters where they were better aerated. There's another bony fish. This is a predator. It's about 1 meter long, Caturus. And this one is fossilized in the process of eating another fish. So there is evidence of sudden death, and this would support Barthel's model of sudden mixing of the waters. These are a modern group of bony fish, the teleosteans, sprat-like fish. And this is a death assemblage. There are hundreds and thousands of these preserved on a single bedding plane. So that's mass death. Again, that supports Barthel's model of sudden mixing. This is a squid. These are the soft tissue of the tentacles. The body would be down here somewhere. Now, these are very common in the lagoon, and they are strong swimmers. So you wouldn't think that they would be washed in because they're such strong swimmers. And so these were probably also living in those upper, better aerated waters. And a clue is from these coprolites. If you find coprolites in a sediment, something must have been living there to produce them. And these were probably produced by the fish and the squid. And if you dissect the coprolites, you find that they're made of plates of crinoids. Now you say to me, but crinoids are embedded in the seabed. How could they live in that hostile hypersalinity? If you look at the Solnhofen crinoids, top left, these are floating crinoids. They don't live on the seabed at all. They're only about 1 centimeter across. They are the most common fossil in Solnhofen limestone. We collected dozens of those when we were there. They've got these little floats on the end of the arms, so they are floating in the upper waters, in the fresher waters. Whereas all of the benthic echinoderms, the starfish, the brittle stars and the sea urchins, which do live on the sea bottom, they are very rare in the Solnhofen limestones. Same with the shrimps and lobsters. They are quite common, but they are often found at the end of what we call a death trail. So these were presumably washed in from the reef tops, landed on the hypersaline bottom, took a few haphazard steps, and then were succumbed. And this is one of the few cases where you ever find a trace fossil at the end of its trace. So that's Mesolimbulus, the horseshoe crab. The big marine reptiles, strong swimmers living in the open sea, they would rarely be washed into the reef. And sure enough, they are very rare. Only known from Solnhofen about a dozen ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs only from a single tooth. Whereas you think how many we find on on the Dorset coast, the Jurassic coast. So these would have been living in the open sea, rarely washed into the lagoon. Same with the cartilaginous fish, the sharks and the rays. Strong swimmers, only occasionally washed into the lagoons. So now let's deal with some of the terrestrial fauna. So these are all obviously allochthonous. They've been preserved not in the area they were living, because these were living on the islands, on the land masses. Solnhofen is very famous for its dragonflies, especially for the beautiful preservation of the venation of the wings. Should say there's no organic tissue preserved here. This is purely a molding of that wing venation in these very, very fine-grained micrites. That just shows how, as a molding material, how good it is to preserve this soft tissue. There are many other insects, but note these are all winged forms. So these would have been flying from the land surface across the lagoon and then perhaps brought down in a storm. Other flying forms, the pterosaurs, again, these are quite common, pretty proficient flyers. They've been around since the Upper Triassic. Both the long-tailed types, Rhamphorhynchus, with these fish-eating jaws, and the short-tailed types, Pterodactylus, with probably eating insects. Again, these were proficient flyers swooping over the lagoon, looking for fish and insects, occasionally brought down in storms and sunk to the bottom. Whereas Archaeopteryx has been described as a feeble flyer, only rarely would have left the land surface, wouldn't have attempted to fly over the lagoon, which is why only occasionally are specimens preserved in the limestones, only 13 specimens. And there's another pterosaur caught by this Caturus predator. So you can imagine him jumping out of the water, grabbing this long-tailed pterosaur, and then both of them are overcome by the mixed high salinities, and they're both preserved in that life pose. This specimen is owned by a millionaire Swiss friend of ours who also owns 2 specimens of Archaeopteryx. I've told him that's very greedy, 2 out of 13. He says this is his favorite fossil. What a wonderful fossil it is. Somewhere there is a little fish preserved in the jaws of the pterosaur as well, but you can't really see that on that picture. And then we come to what I used to say was the only dinosaur from Solnhofen, this little chicken-sized dinosaur, Compsognathus. Only 1 specimen, so it's even more rare than Archaeopteryx. This is a cast in Manchester Museum, but a few years ago we were lucky enough to see the original in Munich. And if you look in the stomach region of this specimen, you can see there the vertebral column and there the tibia and fibia of a little lizard called Bavarisaurus. So you can build up a food web of dinosaurs eating lizards, lizards eating the insects. But now I want to go back to G-hole, because I showed you those birds that were discovered in 1995. The following year, an even greater surprise hit the paleontological world when they started finding quite a lot of skeletons of little theropod dinosaurs. And this was the first one, Sinosauropteryx, the Chinese winged lizard. And this is a Compsognathid. So it's in that same family as Compsognathus from Solnhofen. But the amazing thing about Sinosauropteryx is this soft tissue frill preserved all the way down its dorsal surface, preserved integumentary structures, which if you look at in detail, these have been called protofeathers. They have the same microstructure as the shaft of a modern day bird feather. And so it's thought these were the forerunners of feathers developed presumably for insulation. And these became known, the little dinosaurs, as the feathered dinosaurs. Quite unexpected in the 90s. But since that time, they have been appearing in this G-hole group in huge numbers. The following year, 97, a second one was described, Caudipteryx, the winged tail. You can see this has feathers on the tail. And in this case, these are true feathers. These are not protofeathers. They've got a shaft and barbs, the true feathers, but they are symmetrical. So this animal couldn't fly. There's no hydrodynamic function to them. But then in 2004, this little genus, Microraptor, at the time the smallest dinosaur ever known, was described, hit the press as the 4-winged dinosaur because it had feathers on all 4 wings, the hind limbs as well as the forelimbs. And these feathers were asymmetrical. So this animal could fly in some form or another. Most probably it didn't have powered flight, you know, it didn't have flapping flight. Most probably it was a glider, climbing trees and jumping from branch to branch. And then in 2009, and I did remember this very well because Cindy and I were in the car on the way to Bristol for this SVP conference, Vertebrate Paleo Conference, when it was announced on BBC's Today program that the Chinese would be attending the conference and they would be describing this new feathered dinosaur that they were calling Anchiornis huxleyi, named after Thomas Huxley, Darwin's great supporter, who in 1868 had first proposed the dinosaur-bird link and had then been promptly ignored for 100 years. So this is quite amazing that this specimen is not from the G-hole beds itself. It occurs in the beds below G-hole, called this Tiaoji Shan Formation, which are Oxfordian in age. So the Chinese have at last got their feathered dinosaur older than Archaeopteryx. This is Oxfordian. Archaeopteryx is Tithonian. But it goes further than that. Some of you will recognize this specimen. I'm sorry that Stephen isn't here today because we first saw this in 1998 in Taylor's Museum in Haarlem. It is Archaeopteryx number 4, the oldest specimen of Archaeopteryx from these very oldest Tithonian beds. But this has been redescribed in 2017 as an Anchiornithid dinosaur. So it's not an Archaeopteryx. It is instead another one of these Anchiornithid feathered dinosaurs, the first Anchiornithid to be found outside China. Called Ostromia after the American paleontologist John Ostrom, who first realized in the 1970s that this wasn't a pterosaur, which it had been displayed as for 100 years. He thought it was Archaeopteryx. So it had a 47-year life as Archaeopteryx, and then now it's an Anchiornithid dinosaur, but named after John Ostrom. And I know you don't like any talks without a cladogram. So there is Ostromia on the cladogram, nested with these Anchiornithids. All these are all Chinese genera, but including that Tithonian Ostromia and a little bit earlier than Archaeopteryx. And these are essentially the modern birds, the Pygostylia. So that's essentially all of the modern birds. And there's more. These also from Solnhofen, but these occur from the Kimmeridgian beds just below the Solnhofen limestone. And in 2006, another Compsognathid was described as Duravenator. And then in 2011, this little possible megalosaur, Sciurobimus, the squirrel mimic, was described from the Kimmeridgian. And lo and behold, when this was scanned at the base of the tail here, what did they find but protofeathers? The first preservation of integumentary structures, protofeathers on a dinosaur. Again, the first feathered dinosaur outside China, effectively. I'll just finish off with a little bit more about G-hole because it is such a fascinating Lagerstatten. Read the chapter in the book. It's very good. There's mammals in the G-hole. This is lower Cretaceous when you don't expect to see many mammals, but these are not little mice or rat-sized mammals. These are up to 1 meter long mammals in the lower Cretaceous. And again, if you look at the stomach region of this mammal, those bones that have been colored there are, now the tables have turned, these are the bones of a dinosaur, a juvenile dinosaur, a little Psittacosaurid, that's a ceratopod dinosaur. So now the mammals are eating the dinosaurs, and the tables have truly turned in the lower Cretaceous. Now, I showed you the Solnhofen insects. G-hole has a wonderful proliferation of insects, even better preservation. This is all organic tissue. Not only is organic tissue preserved, but the color is preserved as well in that phasmid and that paleontinin. These are all modern insect orders from the lower Cretaceous. So the modern insects had appeared by that time, and some spiders. and to put that in to satisfy my co-author, because he's a world expert on spiders. And they were evolving hand in hand with the angiosperms, because now we're in the lower Cretaceous, the first angiosperms from this G-hole group, the best fauna of insects from anywhere else in the world. It really is a remarkable Lagerstatten. And I've just done another paleogeographic map, and I've marked on a G-hole again to show how remarkable it is that there's a similarity in the faunas, similar dinosaurs, similar insects, even though there's this huge distance and land barriers between Solnhofen and G-hole. And finally, just a word about preservation. Again, notice these striped sediments, but these orange beds are all volcanic tuffs. So the grey beds are lacustrine, and we know that because they have freshwater mollusks and concostricans. So it's lacustrine sediments alternating with tuff beds, lithified ash. So you can imagine this a lake setting with episodic ash falls. And this is a picture that's been drawn up with so some of the birds, Confuciusornis, flying, feathered dinosaurs unable to fly, Sinosauropteryx with its protofeathers, some little mammals, amphibians and reptiles in the water. But then this peaceful scene likely to be disturbed at any moment by the next volcanic eruption. And it's thought that what happened is that when the volcanoes erupted, the lake setting would have been overcome by toxic gases. Any fauna living around the lake would succumb, possibly fall into the lake, carcasses fall into the lake. Then the ash, huge amounts of ash descending on the lake surface, eventually settles out of suspension and buries those carcasses, again, sealing the system from oxygen and microbial decay. And this is how G-hole is thought to have been preserved. So my final conclusion, how is the time? Oh, it's not too bad at all. You remember I said at the start that these sites were either stagnation or abruption. Well, the only one that's really abruption on its own is Burgess, when we got abruption, burial by the mudslide, and it was the mudslide that killed the animals. Chengjiang, the burial was by the storm deposits, but the death of the biota was really from reduced salinity by that flooding by fresh water. Solnhofen, burial by carbonate ooze, washed in by the storms, but the death of the animals is from hypersalinity. And G-hole, burial from the episodic ash falls, and the death is toxicity from those poisonous volcanic gases. So the only site I could really think of which is purely stagnation is the Holzmaden Shale, Lower Jurassic site in Germany, where you get that wonderful preservation of female ichthyosaurs in the process of giving birth. But that is another lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that very illuminating lecture. Memories of sitting in Harry Whittington's set in college.
What a